Hey guys, it's Sasha. The tariffs that Donald Trump imposed on every country in the world on Liberation Day have just been declared illegal. The US Court of International Trade passed a judgment that Trump did not have the authority to use emergency powers when he first announced these sweeping tariffs on April 2nd. And every time that Donald Trump changed those tariffs randomly a few times a week after that as well. The case was brought by 5 small US businesses who got hit hard by tariffs, but the point really was to treat it a bit like a class action, right? To challenge the power of Donald Trump to unilaterally declare tariffs on any country in the world with no debate, with no scrutiny, with just completely no restraint from Congress. The White House is naturally not very happy about this legal outcome, and the official statement said it is not for unelected judges to decide how to properly address a national emergency. Stephen Miller, the popular White House advisor who has a full-time job of making stuff up on CNBC, said the judicial coup is out of control, except that is exactly why the legal system in the United States exists and why it is set up in the way that it is, to be separate and independent. These judges are there to make sure that everyone, including the president and all of his advisors, operate within the bounds of the law. Most interestingly, out of the 3 judges on this panel, one was appointed by Trump, another one was appointed by Reagan, so it's hard to claim that the decision is somehow politically motivated. And over the last few months, the one major difference between the way that Donald Trump has operated and how most presidents in the US tend to operate is that Donald Trump seems to have decided that every single decision that he wants can just be passed in the form of an executive order. Because this way, you can just decide on any law you feel like. You wake up, you're in a bad mood, slap a bunch of tariffs on people. You wake up, you're in a good mood, go and pass a few other executive orders. It doesn't really matter. You just get to go and do the thing that you want without it being properly looked at, without it being debated, without it being analyzed, without it needing a vote by the House and the Senate. Now, under the US Constitution, it is Congress that has the ultimate power to set tariffs as part of their broad ownership of everything to do with taxation. But there are 2 historical precedents which have given presidents the power to initiate tariffs under specific reasons. One of those is under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, which technically allows the president to enact tariffs. This is the one that was used by Donald Trump to enact these new tariffs that were in place for the last few weeks. And it says to deal with any unusual and extraordinary threat which has its source in whole or substantial part outside the United States to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States. And although this power has been in place technically for almost 50 years now, it has never previously been used. So Donald Trump went and declared a national emergency on April 2nd, which the White House said is sufficient for him to be able to stick tariffs on other countries and do all the rest of it. The court said that declaring a national emergency where there is in fact no emergency does not pass the sniff test. Apparently you're not allowed just to say that there is an emergency without there being an emergency in the first place. So the tariffs that were declared under this act, according to the court, are illegal. And the court has given the White House 10 days to shut down the whole tariff thing completely. So now the White House is going through with an appeal of sorts, but I'm guessing that based on the way this ruling is worded, the appeal may not have a very high chance of succeeding. And the truth is, the powers that exist that enable the White House to navigate a sharp economic crisis by imposing tariffs quickly to stop the situation spiraling out of control are there for a reason other than trying to negotiate with countries, other than trying to, exert your power over the whole world. That's not what they were initially designed for. In 1971, the previous time that something similar happened, President Nixon used a similar power from a different act, because that was before the 1977 Act, that was for the 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act, to issue temporary 10% tariffs because the US was actually going through a monetary crisis. The US economy began imploding after the Bretton Woods system was abolished and the dollar stopped being pegged to gold, and this was called the Nixon shock. And to stop the sudden fluctuation in currency and all the turmoil, Nixon imposed this global import tariff. At that point, there was an actual pretty major emergency. This time around, there is no specific major emergency that is being addressed. Now, the United States does have a problem with having a lot of debt. That hasn't really changed at any point in the last, it just keeps growing. And there is a problem with the budget deficit, which keeps running high and growing. But presumably, if it was a genuine, massive problem, that it would be an emergency, right? If the current government was so concerned about the size of the deficit, to call it an emergency, they probably would not be busy trying to pass a new law that makes this deficit even larger. I don't know, just thinking out loud. According to several legal experts, it seems that the appeal process, if that appeal process does not work, Donald Trump does have some other avenues, some other laws that would enable him to enact similar tariffs anyway. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 lets the president declare tariffs without congressional oversight, but it only applies in cases where there is a balance of payment issues. And this is basically saying that if there is a trade deficit with the US, then this section can be used. But that means all of the countries where the United States does not in fact have a trade deficit cannot have tariffs applied to them using this particular approach. So good news for the penguins from the Heard and McDonald Islands. It's also kind of funny because the UK has already rushed to go and sign a trade deal with the United States, where the UK went and made a whole bunch of concessions in an attempt to try to get rid of that tariff, which wasn't got rid of anyway. But it now turns out that the 10% tariff that they were threatened with and that is in place can't even be applied to the UK in the first place because the US actually has a trade surplus with the UK. So I have no idea what that means for that deal that they signed. Well, they signed a thing that will eventually become a deal, but it's going to be pretty amusing to see how the UK government responds to this one, given they negotiated against tariffs that apparently will no longer exist. The good news for the UK is that most of the thing that they signed with the United States was just a bunch of promises to work on something. It's like an agreement to have a framework to maybe have a deal at some point in the future. So I guess that probably means that deal in the future might now be dead in the water, perhaps. And if Donald Trump does use that Section 122 power, it does limit the tariffs to just 150 days, after which the Congress then has to go and pass a law to keep the tariffs in place. So they're meant to be temporary, and these tariffs cannot be greater than 15%, which means that almost all the tariffs on countries that the US does have a trade deficit with would have to be lowered. It is also an interesting question as to what happens with the ongoing negotiations that are apparently happening with China and the EU. Donald Trump, remember, suspended the 145% tariff on China and lowered it to just 30%, and he suspended the 50% tariff on Europe as well a few days ago while the negotiations are ongoing. But this court ruling basically says that those original high tariffs, the threat that they were putting on all the other countries can't be applied anyway. So I guess that's not going to be good news for that Trump negotiation team who used the threat of the high tariffs as a means of getting better trade deals, or I don't really know what they were trying to get. They were trying to magically make other countries start buying US goods in high volumes, which is not really going to happen. But anyway, there are other options available as well. Apparently, I'm not a lawyer, like Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1930, some others, but they will apparently require formal investigations into trade with each country to be launched. Those investigations have to actually be completed, have to conclude before the tariffs are enacted. So that's probably going to mean significant delays to Donald Trump's plans and his strategy of, shooting from the hip. So the other option is to go and slap tariffs on the imports of specific types of goods, because apparently that is something the president does have pretty good authority to do. Like those tariffs on steel, aluminium, and cars, those are apparently staying, the ones that Donald Trump announced before the country-specific tariffs. The problem is that you can't set different rates for different countries on goods. So it would make country-specific negotiations very, very difficult, because multiple different countries can be importing the same goods, and you would need the same tariff applied based on goods category. Section 338 apparently allows the president to announce new tariffs of up to 50% on countries that discriminate against the United States. And this section has also, like the other one, never been used before, and I guess the risk there of trying to switch to using this section is that the courts might then go and try to determine that the penguins from the herd of McDonald Islands have in fact not discriminated against the United States, or perhaps they haven't discriminated enough to warrant a tariff. The biggest problem for the White House with this latest new plot twist in the tariff saga is that the threat of tariffs is beginning to be actively ignored more and more every single time there is a new tariff announcement. When the first tariffs, the big tariffs, were announced on April 2nd, the whole stock market went into panic mode. Everything sold off, the market was red, it was just tanking every day, the markets were in real trouble. But now that we've had every week several new announcements, the markets largely ignored that 50% tariff threat on the European Union when that was announced just a few days ago. And then it was paused a few days later until mid-July. Again, the markets were like, yeah, whatever. We just don't care anymore. We know it's all just complete bullshit, right? It appears that the boy who cried wolf scenario is beginning to play out here. And when you've already threatened countries with a huge tariff, like you can pay huge tariffs 2, 3, 5 times in just a few weeks, each subsequent time that you go and threaten people with the tariff carries a little bit less weight. Now, with this latest court ruling, other countries have a much bigger incentive to not take the trade threats seriously and just ignore the Trump administration's attempts to try to get whatever deals it is that they want, because those threats now have a high likelihood of disappearing for one reason or another a few days after being announced. To quote a comment I saw somewhere on social media, the art of the deal first turned into the fart of the deal, and after this latest ruling it is beginning to smell a lot like the shart of the deal. It's also not clear what happens to all the small businesses who, paid the eye-watering tariffs on imports from China and other countries when their goods arrived in ports after the April 2nd announcement. Some of those businesses have been collapsing, going bankrupt, people having to sell their houses. What about those people? Presumably, if the court has decided that the original tariff was unconstitutional, well then all of that money should now be refunded, right? Returned, as it should never have been collected and charged in the first place. I am sure getting the money back by small businesses from the external revenue service will be extremely fast, absolutely super easy with no issues whatsoever. The stock market has reacted very cautiously, as you would expect, to this news. Stocks are up a little bit today as I'm recording this video, but after the turmoil and volatility of recent weeks, it just seems like a very mild response, as everyone is just waiting to see what actually happens on the back of this ruling, and because nobody seems to give a shit anymore about what happens with these tariffs, because nobody believes they will ever properly happen anyway. Now, one obvious way for the White House to make the tariffs actually work is, to do it the old-fashioned way, by passing a law, I know, crazy, through Congress, where the Republicans hold a majority. But I guess the issue there is that if they were to do that, well then the reason for implementing the tariffs, the bullshit reasons, the expected result, the outcome of the tariffs, the actual size, the percentage amount of the tariffs would all have to go an actual examination. There would have to be scrutiny, there would have to be a meaningful debate, which would immediately highlight the obvious issues with the rationale and the implementation of the tariff plan. I guess we will have to wait and see what happens. I will update you right here on the channel, so make sure you subscribe for future updates. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later.